I'm guilty of that.
Sometimes I can't see it. Stop light at the corner.
Drive right down this hill on the street.
Hey everybody, this is Paul Broder from the Marlboro Historic Society. Graciously offered to help us with the tour.
So, why is Spring Hill the first of our cemeteries? Well, it's kind of an odd story. Most cemeteries in New England, first cemeteries, are right near the first meeting houses. All right, that's almost always the case. But in Marlboro, that wasn't possible because the fathers of Marlboro decided to place their meeting house out of town. Essentially is what they did. They placed it on the Indian plantation. Now, how much confusion there was at that time, I don't know, but it, in fact, was the case. So they had to negotiate with the Indians, place the meeting house where the Walker Building is. And at the time, they were only able to negotiate the land for the meeting house, not for the cemetery. Cemetery at the Walker Building comes much later, when they were able to get some land. So this, I believe, more than likely, was property of John Howe Sr., who lived not too many blocks away, had a large farm, and I believe it was on his land that they established the first cemetery. So let's continue on. Oh, actually, we want a few thank yous to begin with. First of all, to the Daughters of the American Republic, who were responsible for the stonework for the two ministers and for Edward Hutchinson. All right, so it really helps to beautify the space and places the first church in a certain light. Also, to Artemus Ward, the descendant of General Artemus Ward, who, just before he died, came to both Shrewsbury and Marlborough, where his forefathers had resided, and decided to beautify certain spaces, including the cemetery here. You'll notice that the Ward family has many concrete structures that support the old Ward family plots. Also, last but not least, the city of Marlborough, who very graciously restored the stone tablets at the graves of Reverend Brinsmead and Reverend Breck, and otherwise helped to beautify the land. And especially in this regard, we want to thank John Galoni, who put a lot of effort into the restoration. Okay, let's go.
So we'll go on to around this way, and up to you see the two tablets. The two tablets. They're hiding.
Yeah, that's cool. And then like within a week, this was all messed up.
So good morning. I think it's still morning. I'm delighted that you came to celebrate with us the history, our 350th anniversary, our first 350th anniversary, so we hope. I'm standing here and I have Reverend Brinsmead here on my right and Reverend Breck on my left. There were two ministers, and if I'm correct, they almost span the history from 1666 until 1570. When did Breck die?
1731.
1731.
Good job.
So I know they were around for a while. So Brinsmead was the first Puritan minister here in Marlborough, and one of the things you have to understand is the Congregational Church was the established church, which meant that as soon as a city was formed, everybody, whether you liked the minister or not, whether you were a member of the church or not, whether you liked his sermons or not, You paid for my support, basically. So, but there were some problems with Mr. Brimsmead and how much they thought they could come up with. So for 6 years, he actually left Marlborough and preached on the Cape, and finally he was ordained on October 3rd, if I'm correct, 1666. And when we say ordained, because it's a congregational church, there is no other authority. That means he was ordained for the service in First Church. And they didn't leave. Pastors did not transfer until 18th century. So First Church of Marlborough, you're stuck with me. So this was William Brimsmead. After he dies, he was an odd little fellow. First of all, he never married, which was very unusual in those times. I think I'm the second one after him not to marry, so I'll just leave it at there. I'll let you play with that. And the second one was Mr. Breck. Mr. Breck was a very pious man. His son was a minister in Springfield. His son-in-law was the first minister in Westboro. He had very long prayers, I'm told. So again, we have the graves of the first two ministers, and it really is a testimony to them that they stayed for such a long, long time at First Church. Reverend Brimsmead also had a little quirk. He never baptized children who were born on the Sabbath, meaning Sunday. If you're wondering why, well, there was a superstition that the baby was born on the day of the week on which it was conceived. So think about this. That means the parents were not busy in the meeting house on a Sunday. So there was another minister who also refused to baptize children born on a Sunday until his son was born to him on Sunday. Apparently he reformed his ways. So Mr. Brimsmead dies. After a few years, they elect Mr. Breck. And then there are so many, I can't count, I think I'm at number 29 after William Brimsmead and Mr. Breck. So anyway, I'm delighted that you came to celebrate with us our 350th anniversary. It is a great anniversary. There's a lot of funny stuff in our history. For example, one of my predecessors, we don't know why, but we seem to think his sermons were a little too long because people fired into his study to kind of get a hint that he should resign. He did not take the hint. In fact, he stayed for a few more years. And then finally the elders came in and says, "Brother, it's time to retire." And he did, and he retired in Sudbury. So these are the first two graves of the first two ministers, Puritans, very old men. Remember, you would come on Sunday, there was no entertainment, there was no sports. You came to the service. There was a morning service. After the service, 2.5 hours. You went on the green, you ate lunch, and then you came for the evening service. 1.5 hours. You ate dinner. That was Sunday. So there you go. So I'm delighted that you are here to celebrate it with us, our 350th anniversary. Our big service will be October 2nd, 3 p.m. The Patriots are not playing, or whoever it is. And even if they were, it's way too bigger than the Patriots. I'm sorry. So you're free to come 3 p.m. October 2nd. Again, I'm delighted that you are here to celebrate this great story of Marlborough and our church. There will be more people to follow, but these are the first two people that...
You also have one in front of you and one in back.
Oh, I do. Well, this is Reverend Beaumont. As you can see, he's a little bit later. And who's in beside him, behind me?
Goodhue.
Oh, Mr. Goodhue. And there's actually two other ministers are buried in Marlborough, not at this cemetery of First Church. And you can ask me later because I have the notes upstairs, so in my study. So anyway, I'm delighted that you're here. We hope that this walk will be interesting for you. If you have any questions, ask Cindy. Yeah. Yes, and you have it in your, it's "Oh God, our help in ages past." In thy sight are like an evening dawn, short as the watch that ends the quest, and our eternal home.
This hymn was sung on this spot 100 years ago.
Brief little talk about each of the ministers, and then continue on to some of the other prominent characters who are buried here, especially those associated with the church. So, as the pastor mentioned, Reverend Brimsmead was the first. He came and left Marlborough in mysterious circumstances. He was born in Dorchester, went to Harvard but never graduated, and he was here until 1663 and left in some mysterious circumstances. We do know that it was political. It was mentioned in the town records, and just as mysteriously, he returns in 1666, and this marks the beginning of the parish, as we say. So, one of the things that was outstanding about Reverend Brinsmead was his ability to get along with people who were at each other's throats, literally. There was a great deal of division within the town at that time, and he was able to develop relationships with everyone. And that really, he was the glue. When it came to the King Philip's War that was raging, and we'll talk about one of the characters. The first person who died here was during that war, and it was the Reverend Brinsmead who brought the town together to draw up a plan for the defense. It wasn't the selectmen or anybody else in the town. It was the Reverend. So he was a very important character. During the war, his home was burned to the ground, as many of the other homes were, and he had to leave Marlborough. Marlborough was almost completely abandoned. He returned after the war and helped to bring the life of the town back to where it was. So he was a very, very important character. He served for about 40 years, and his notebook, I believe was written in Latin, is at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Reverend Breck came next, and he was brought into the pastorate in 1704. He was only 22 years old. He was a man of great intellect, an outstanding linguist. He regularly would teach his family in Hebrew at home. Can't even comprehend that. He came to town when the historical divisions among the people remained strong. So they were still divided. It took him a number of years before he agreed to come. And not only that, but there were still Indian raids. There were a great number of Indian abductions of Marlborough residents during his tenure here, especially in the early years. So it was a very great challenge. He was a leader not only in Marlborough, but among the ministers in the area. He started the Marlborough Association in 1725, and that lasted until 1814. So what the ministers would do is they would gather and they would talk about the challenges within their own ministries, and they would, talk about and support one another. So this is a very important feature. He was a great leader. He died in 1731, having served 27 years. Now, if you notice, if you look closely, there's an inscription, very much faded, on Reverend Breck's tablet. And it's in Latin, but if you look at the next page, you can read what it says there, translation of what it says. Okay, he was a great man. Next we have Reverend John Goodhue. Very nice little list here. He was from Salem originally, graduated at Amherst and studied theology at Andover and Yale. He began his pastorate in 1836. At the time, there had been a split and a division of the church, and they had come together and created the Union Church. All right, so he was the first pastor to come after the reuniting of the church. He was also the first pastor to serve in the brand new church that was built in 1836. The prior church was way too big. It was built to serve the whole town, and there was a division in 1806. So this church, the church built in 1806, was way too large. So they took down that church, built a new church, and Reverend Goodhue was the first to serve in that church. Unfortunately, he only served for 3 years. He contracted typhoid fever, and he died at the age of 29 in 1839. He was widely believed to be one of the most learned and ablest of the ministers of his time, and the people really did love him. Died too young. Somewhat of a similar story with Reverend Beaumont. Reverend Beaumont was born in Sheffield, England, and he was tutored by the University Ministers of England. Received his theological training at Bangor Theological Seminary and the Chicago Theological School. He began his pastorate in 1929 at the beginning of the Great Depression, so he too had many challenges. He was greatly loved in the parish and throughout the city and was known for his self-sacrifice. He took ill in the fall of 1934 and died in January 1935. So he was a 20th century pastor. Not too many people were buried here in the 20th century. After his death, the youth program to which he was particularly devoted was named after him. Okay, so
If you're wondering about the little stone, that is Reverend Breck's daughter. She died at 19 years old, having had 2 children. She was the second wife of Abraham Williams. His first wife died in childbirth with her 3rd child. His 3rd wife was a little bit more stable. She delivered 13 children, 3 of which died. So he had quite a lineage, and that's probably why you hear Williams all over the place. But that's the daughter's stone.
And her son
what I would
also.
call the cornerstone burial in Spring Hill Cemetery. It's Edward Hutchinson, the first person buried here. Edward Hutchinson is a central figure in early American history, and this place is worth visiting just for him. His mother was the notorious Anne Hutchinson, who was basically exiled for heresy during the Antinomian crisis in the early colonial days, and she was exiled to Rhode Island, and it's a wonder that he becomes a very central character in early Massachusetts colonial history. His great-grandson was Thomas Hutchinson, who was exiled to England because he was the governor of Massachusetts just before the Revolution. And he was forced to leave and go back to England because of his loyalist sympathies. So you have Edward Hutchinson right in the middle. Now, Edward Hutchinson, after his mother is exiled, he returns and he reconciles himself with the authorities in Massachusetts and joins the military. And in 1675, in the summer of 1675, he's sent to Brookfield to negotiate with the Nipmucks, who apparently had decided against negotiation. They ambush him along with his party, and he is badly wounded. On returning, Marlborough was the first frontier outpost after Brookfield, and so they bring him here, where he dies a few days later and is buried here. Now, if you ask me what came first, the cemetery or his burial, I can't tell you. It may be that the other burials came around where he was buried. I don't know. But it is almost certain by tradition that he was the first one buried here. He's also the ancestor to 3 United States presidents, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the 2 Bushes, George Bush Sr. and George W. Bush. All right, so very important character.
Can I ask, remember how I told you that there was one church and you all had to pay for me? That was Massachusetts. So Massachusetts, Anne Hutchinson, she was a woman who thought she could preach. Well, not so fast. So they exiled her to Rhode Island that had full religious freedom. And that's why the Puritan called Rhode Island the sewer of New England. So, there you go.
Okay, so here we have a very interesting monument. It says Reverend Edward Warren, son of Thaddeus and Lucy Warren. Some other notes said Sophia Stevens Warren, but we'll sort that out. They were closely related to the Goodales, to whose lot we'll be going next. But he was a very, very interesting and tragic figure in Marlborough history. He contracted tuberculosis when he was young. Despite that, he decided to go to college, went to Middlebury College. In 1811, he has a conversion experience and decides that he wants to be a missionary, especially a missionary to Asia. So he goes for medical training at Dartmouth, very, very intelligent man, and then he goes to theology training at Andover Newton. In 1815, he plans to go immediately to Asia, but he has a health reversal and his plans are almost completely demolished. But he does recover, and later that year, he goes with the famous Reverend Daniel Poor to Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. All right, and there they established a school for boys and girls at Philippi, and that school is still operating. Matter of fact, I believe there's another school named after Reverend Warren in Sri Lanka. So he was very much loved there. He only served for a few years. In 1817, he has another health reversal. And so he was only there for 2 years. He served both in medicine and in education. And but he's forced, because of his health, to go to South Africa, where they believe the climate will be better for him. But unfortunately, he has another health reversal there, and he dies. So this memorial stone is just a memorial stone. He's not buried here, he's buried in South Africa. But a great man who served only a few years and died tragically too young.
And we have his papers. We actually found by accident his papers. I was doing some research. Princeton Theological Seminary has a journal he kept on a ship to Ceylon, and then they have his also goodbye letter that he wrote to his father and to his little sister, who was also dying of tuberculosis. So he writes a little letter to them. It's a goodbye letter, and then there's a letter of his friend that it's sent to his father after he had died. Very moving pieces. So.
And they sent you scans of.
Yeah, they sent me scans. So I kind of played the 350th anniversary, and they sent the scans for free.
There are others as well. So this is an interesting plot because it's probably as famous for the one who isn't buried here as for those who are buried here. We'll get to that in a minute. But of those who are buried here, it's the line of the prominent Goodale family who served many, many years, many of them deacons of the church, the first church. And so this is many, many years of service to the church represented here and to the city of Marlborough, the town of Marlborough. It contains the godfather of them all, Deacon Abner Goodale, and some of his children and grandchildren, Deacon David Goodale and Deacon David B. Goodale. Now, for the one who wasn't buried here, Deacon David's sister Lucy achieved great fame and great popular awareness of her in the book Hawaii by Michener, the great novel by Michener. The story almost begins in Marlborough where Lucy marries almost not knowing him. She marries the great missionary Asa Thurston from Fitchburg. And they leave immediately for the Sandwich Islands, where she lives a long life. And the Thurstons are very, very important in the development and education of the people in the islands. And she lives a long life there, although she did have breast cancer, and she was operated on without any anesthesia at the time. I can't even imagine that. Lived a few more years. But she's buried in Oahu, Hawaii. Her daughter, however, is buried here. Her daughter, Lucy, came back to the States for her education, and she got sick when she arrived in New York City, and she did die in New York, and they brought her here to be buried. So she, too, is in the family plot. Now, her mother's letters were compiled and printed, so there's a great deal that we know about her mother, Lucy. It's a great, great, important family, probably one of the most prominent families in Marlborough.
Paul, so when Paul said that she didn't know her husband, Edward Warren has a friend who's also wants to become a missionary. And Edward sailed as a bachelor because they knew he was dying. But you do not send young men to all these exotic countries, you know, when women are not as clad as European women in the 19th century on their own, so they have to marry. So Asa Thurston comes and visits his cousin of the Goodales, another missionary, and he says, I need a wife in 2 weeks. And so he says, well, I have 3 good Christian women who are crazy, loving enough to do this. So Asa goes and proposes to 2, and they're like, you know what, I'll think about it. Well, his cousin is like, well, my cousin, she's a bit odd, she's teaching at the school, let me run down and propose for you. So he goes to Lucy, and he says, so he's handsome, he's young, all right, he's a missionary. And she said, when are we sailing? He said, 2 weeks. She said, sign me on. So actually, he only met after she accepted him. So that's how they were married. And again, they were married, he was ordained and set up because, again, you do not want all these young men in all these exotic places with all these, women who are way too exotic for Puritan ministers. So, but that's how they were married.
Great story, Pastor. Great story. Much better than the way I told it. So, now Esther Goodale, a long descendant of Abner, is the last person we believe to be buried in the Spring Hill Cemetery. And our information is that she passed away in 1995, and she too is buried in the Goodale plot.
Well, thank you, Paul. And if anybody wants more in-depth history, we just published our 4th edition of the history. It's available back up at the church. They're $10 each, and they go through 2015, a little bit into 2016, and you get all the stories about those interesting first ministers. And thank you, Paul, for your work and your presentation.
Oh yes, I'm going to be giving a talk at the Historical Society on the life and times of Reverend Brinsmead and Reverend Breck in support of the historical efforts here at First Church. And there's not a lot that you can find about each pastor, about the times that they lived in were really, really fascinating. And the people of Marlborough were very, very fascinating people as well. So we'll be talking a lot about what the ministers had to deal with in their times. I would also say that the very early Puritans, the first generation Puritans that came over, believed that it was a matter of vanity to have a stone at your burial place. So there are probably a larger number of those first generation men who are buried here and have no stone, and we really don't know where they're buried. Thank you. Have a great weekend.